following video is a historical representation created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. It is intended for educational and documentary purposes.
For more than 70 years, the Titanic lay hidden nearly 4,000 meters below the surface, far beyond human sight. When the first expeditions finally lit up the floor of the North Atlantic, one thing became clear. The ship's condition did not fully match the stories told after the disaster. The pattern of debris, the split hull, and the level of destruction all point to a final moment far more violent than anyone once believed. Every object resting on the ocean floor now serves as physical evidence, helping researchers piece together what truly happened in the early hours of 1912. If this kind of evidence-based historical investigation speaks to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what caught your attention so far. Your support keeps this kind of deep dive storytelling alive. As the submersible moves forward, the bow of the Titanic slowly comes into view. Steel that was once smooth and imposing is now coated in deep corrosion, the result of more than a century under crushing pressure and freezing temperatures. Railings appear, twisted outward, bent by forces that pushed from the inside out during the ship's final moments. In some areas, numbers and markings are still visible, confirming the identity of the structure. The damage is uneven, suggesting that different parts of the ship responded in very different ways as it went down. These first observations already tell us one thing: the collapse was far more complex than the early accounts ever suggested. Moving beyond the bow, the spotlights reveal personal belongings scattered across the seabed. Pairs of shoes appear separated, half buried in sediment, silent signs that they were torn from their owners in the final chaos. Suitcases lie ripped open, frames crushed, their contents spread across the ocean floor. Fragments of fabric still cling to the mud and metal, preserved only by darkness and cold. There is no pattern to where these items rest, reinforcing the idea of a violent, disordered sinking. The physical evidence suggests the ship was breaking apart while still in motion, hurling people and possessions into the sea without mercy. As the submersible approaches areas where the hull has been torn open, the ship's interior comes into view. Steel beams appear snapped or folded, exposing the extreme stresses placed on the structure. Loose cables and ruptured pipes cut across the scene, signs of a sudden and brutal separation inside the vessel. These openings don't look like the result of impact alone, but of failures that began while the ship was still descending. The way the pieces lie suggests the hull lost its integrity unevenly, with some sections giving way long before others. Together, these clues point to a structural collapse far more complex than a simple controlled flooding. The journey continues toward the ship's external technical areas, where critical systems are now exposed. Massive valves sit buried under thick corrosion, their mechanisms frozen by cold and time. Pipes appear crushed or torn apart, evidence of sudden pressure changes during the descent. Steel plates show irregular bends and fractures that don't match a single final impact. These components were designed to withstand enormous loads, which only highlights the scale of the forces that destroyed them. Studying these systems reveals how structural failure spread rapidly through the ship. Across the debris field, ship tools and mechanical parts lie scattered with no clear order. Wrenches, levers, and pieces of machinery appear warped, often far from where they were meant to be used. Larger components, gears and metal supports, sit half-buried, signs they were thrown outward with great force. Many of these objects point in the same general direction, suggesting the ship was still moving when it began to break apart. This doesn't match the idea of a quiet separation on the ocean floor. The evidence points instead to a progressive rupture while the Titanic was still descending. As the submersible pulls back from the densest areas, the debris field comes into view on a wider scale. Large objects appear mixed with tiny fragments, scattered without order. This pattern shows the wreckage did not fall straight down, but spread along a long trajectory. The growing distance between items reinforces the image of a ship breaking apart as it sank. Heavy pieces rest beside light ones, something unlikely in a single collapse at the bottom. Everything we see confirms destruction in multiple stages, unfolding all the way to the seabed. Deeper into the field, the first undeniable signs of the hull's rupture emerge. The edges of steel plates appear jagged and torn, bent outward by internal forces, not by impact from below. This kind of damage doesn't fit a slow, controlled break. In many places, plates are pulled apart as if the ship gave way under growing tension. These physical signs stand in sharp contrast to the traditional story of the sinking. What lies on the ocean floor tells a different tale, one of sudden and violent structural collapse. Closer to the most damaged zones, small details become impossible to ignore. Rivets appear loose or missing entirely, leaving visible gaps between steel plates. In some areas, the plates are misaligned, as if they slid past each other under extreme stress. This kind of failure doesn't happen in isolation. It signals a gradual loss of strength across the hull. Seeing the same pattern in multiple sections strengthens the case for widespread structural weakness. The evidence suggests the ship began to fail at many points long before the final break. As the submersible nears the zone between the bow and the break point, the scene grows visibly chaotic. Fragments of every size overlap, forming uneven layers of metal, wood, and sediment. Structural elements lie broken in different directions, proof of forces acting at once. The density of debris increases, visibility drops, and the landscape becomes confused and crowded. This doesn't look like a single rupture point. It looks like a wide zone of progressive failure. Everything suggests the ship came apart over time, not in one instant. Moving through the wreckage, objects that once symbolized safety and wealth come into view. Safes appear crushed, some forced open, others half buried, clear signs of violent impact. Suitcases lie torn apart, their contents scattered across the seabed. Metal pieces that once gleamed now sit corroded and unrecognizable. The contrast between their original purpose and their current state marks the complete collapse of the luxury once tied to this ship. If this kind of real, evidence-based analysis matters to you, like the video, subscribe, and tell us what stands out most in this exploration. As navigation continues, the trail of debris stretches on under the lights. Fragments appear dozens of meters apart, breaking long stretches of empty seafloor. This distance shows they didn't break loose at one point. They were scattered along the ship's final path. Heavy pieces lie isolated, followed by nearly clean areas, signs of violent dispersal. The pattern demands a massive release of energy during the sinking. All evidence points to a final phase marked by extreme force and rapid fragmentation. Approaching the zone of total rupture, the level of deformation becomes extreme. Entire sections appear crushed. Components pressed together in chaotic ways. Parts that once had clear functions are now barely recognizable. Beams twist in multiple directions, showing forces acting from both inside and outside the structure. This degree of destruction cannot be explained by a single impact on the seafloor. The evidence points to a violent, progressive collapse just before the ship finally split apart. As the lights move beyond the crushed zone, the full scale of the disaster finally comes into focus. For the first time, it becomes clear that the Titanic does not rest as one piece, but as two. The bow lies ahead, relatively intact. The stern sits far away, shattered, collapsed, and broken. The distance between them leaves no doubt the ship split while still sinking. What we see confirms it. The destruction came before the final impact with the ocean floor. Moving closer to the stern, the debris field reaches its greatest extent. Fragments spread across an area far larger than early reports ever suggested. The irregular pattern and wide spacing reveal a separation under intense mechanical stress. Open plates, torn components, and pieces thrown sideways don't match a slow, orderly sinking. These physical facts force a scientific reevaluation of the tragedy. The ocean floor tells us the Titanic broke apart with far more violence and complexity than anyone believed for decades. After the full scale of the disaster is revealed, the journey slows. The lights now catch isolated objects, separated by vast stretches of empty seabed. They form no clusters, follow no patterns, each one tied to an individual life. With no large structures left, every find feels more personal. No emotional interpretation is needed. Their silent presence alone speaks to the human cost of the tragedy. The exploration moves into areas where metal failure is unmistakable. Rivets appear brittle, many snapped clean in two, a sign of lost flexibility. Steel plates show irregular cracks, consistent with materials exposed to extreme cold. Instead of bending, the metal fractured, a classic response to freezing temperatures. The same patterns repeat across the wreck. Everything points to the environment itself playing a direct role in the Titanic's collapse. Reaching the stern, the destruction looks very different from what we saw at the bow. Here, structures are fully collapsed, deformation far more severe. Instead of recognizable shapes, much of the stern appears crushed and fragmented. This contrast shows that the two sections endured different forces. While the bow descended more steadily, the stern faced turbulence and structural chaos. The evidence confirms both halves of the ship followed very different paths in their final moments. Inside the exposed spaces of the stern, mechanical systems dominate the view. Machines sit torn open, their housings broken, inner parts exposed. Gears appear warped, some pushed far from their original positions. Pipes run exposed and ruptured, crossing the scene in disorder. These systems were built for controlled conditions, not for structural collapse. Their state confirms the stern suffered a fast and violent destruction at the very end. Moving between different sections allows a direct comparison of preservation patterns. In some areas, structures remain partly intact, lines and shapes still recognizable. In others, everything is reduced to fragments with no clear form. This contrast is not random, it reflects different phases of the sinking. Parts that descended more steadily suffered less damage. Sections caught in rotations and internal collapses endured far greater forces, leaving almost nothing behind. As the journey continues, personal items appear once more, now spaced even farther apart. Small objects rest alone in the sediment, separated by long stretches of empty seafloor. With no major structures left, every fragment stands out. They don't point to a single breakpoint, but to the end of the debris field itself. The growing distance suggests this stage came after most of the ship had already disintegrated. The ocean floor begins to look almost deserted, interrupted only by scattered traces of human presence. As the submersible pulls away, the debris field comes into view as a whole. Structures, fragments, and empty zones align into one long stretch across the seabed. The distance traveled reveals the site is not a single point, but spans miles. From this perspective, the true scale of the disaster becomes clear. What once seemed scattered now forms a coherent body of evidence. The wide view confirms the magnitude of the event and the complexity of the process that sent the Titanic to the deep. With the main site fading behind, the scene grows still. Only a few structures remain visible, motionless beneath decades of sediment. Particles drift slowly across the frame, moved only by deep currents. There are no signs of recent human presence. The vastness of the ocean now dwarfs what remains of the ship. Here, mankind's creation seems small, and the sea's silent permanence takes over. With time, the effects of decay become undeniable. steel is covered in advanced corrosion, shaped by endless chemical reactions with seawater. Biological colonies spread across every surface, speeding up the breakdown. Parts that once held the ship together now serve only as a home for microscopic life. This process is not sudden or dramatic, but it is relentless. The Titanic continues to change, not by impact, but by the quiet power of the ocean itself. At the far edges of the debris field, a few details still stand out. Instruments appear lifeless, their dials corroded, mechanisms frozen in time. Metal plates remain, but their inscriptions have long since faded away. Small structural pieces are still recognizable, despite heavy corrosion. They don't suggest preservation, only survival. Silent proof of engineering pushed into one of the harshest environments on Earth. As the submersible moves farther away, the last traces of the Titanic fade from the lights. Once clear structures turn into soft silhouettes, swallowed by the deep. Isolated fragments disappear one by one, replaced by empty stretches of seafloor. With every meter, the distance from the wreck grows. The ship stops being a visible reality and becomes scattered memory. The ocean takes back the stage, hiding once more what was revealed for only a few brief hours. The lights slowly fade. The ocean floor returns to complete silence. This place remains as a physical reminder of the limits of human engineering.